Travel photography is one of the most exciting types of photography for two reasons. Number one, you finally get to visit places you've dreamed of visiting and you get to photograph them. And two, with your photos, you also get to tell a story about the place and about your experience there. But sometimes things just don't work out as expected. Either the light is not what you expected, so it's too harsh maybe, or it's super cloudy, or you suddenly only have time to shoot at night, or there's just tourists in the way of every shot you're trying to take. But the thing is, you can get amazing photos in any of these situations if you know how to deal with them. So in this video, I'm going to share 4 essential travel photography tips that you can apply today that'll help you take photos that not only look amazing, but also represent your experience at the place. So let's start with the first one. Okay, tip number 1 is don't go for the obvious shot. And I've heard this phrase a couple of times now from different photographers, and I have to say I agree with it, but I also partly disagree. Essentially, what this phrase means is that don't go for the same photo that everyone else is going for. You know, the postcard type of shot that you see everywhere online. And on the one hand, I agree that if you go for the same photo, your photo will basically look the same or even worse than anyone else's, and it just won't feel special. But the reason I disagree is that sometimes I just have shots that really inspired me and that I wanted to capture as well. And for some locations, we just don't get to visit too often, so these shots feel like a once in a lifetime opportunity. So my advice here is don't only go for the obvious shot. So what I mean by this is go for the obvious shot that you came there to take, and then take less obvious shots. And you can often find these less obvious shots in the moments in between when you're traveling from one location to another, for example. Or sometimes just by wandering around the location of your famous landmark and kind of exploring the area around your bucket list shot place. Because honestly, most people don't even do that. So by not only going for the obvious shot, you ensure that you have your bucket list shot, which is important, and you also make sure that you get more unique photos that kind of tell your experience of exploring the place, that are just more unique to your story, and overall, most of the time, they're more memorable. Okay, tip number 2 is think in photo sets. This is essential to really capture a place, because if you think about it, you probably cannot capture a place in one single photo, and you don't really have to. So by thinking in photo sets, you really prevent yourself from taking random snapshots that don't fit together really well and that don't really tell a kind of coherent story. Okay, that's great and all to know, but how do you actually create a set that works? For this, you need 3 kinds of shots: establishing shots, ambience shots, and detail shots. So let's have a quick look at what each of these shots really need to work for you. Okay, so establishing shots are usually shot on wider focal length, like 35 millimeters or below. These shots are the cornerstone of your set that give your viewer information about what kind of place they're really looking at, which is why they usually include easily recognizable things like landmarks or specific details of the place that are just really easily recognizable. And when it comes to establishing shots, you don't need a lot of them, but you do need them to tell your viewer where the set takes place. Next up are ambience shots. These can be about anything that makes the destination unique or is just remarkable about it outside of the landmarks. So these shots can be about people or transport, shops, or architecture or cultural elements. I usually take these shots on a focal length between 35 and 50 millimeters, but don't get too hung up on these numbers. It really depends on the place and your distance to the subject to really make this work. What's important here is to showcase elements that are within the place you're visiting. And ambience shots will probably make up the majority of your travel photos. Okay, lastly, we have detail shots. These are about things that really captured your interest and just really stood out to you. This could be just about how the light fell in a specific moment, about unique interactions, or just of the most mundane things. Because remember, these photos by themselves don't have to be too amazing. They just have to kind of fit into the set to tell a coherent story. And to be fair, I don't really have a recommended focal length when it comes to detail shots. And the shots I've shown you here range from somewhere between 29 millimeters to 75 millimeters. Okay, next tip is use available light. And when it comes to travel photography, a lot of photographers tend to say that the best time to shoot is golden hour, sunrise, or sunset, simply because the light is really soft and the gold light just looks amazing. And I do agree that the light during this time can feel amazing, but I urge you to really shoot in any available light that you have and don't limit yourself to the same 2 or 3 hours of the day. Because when traveling, you probably don't always have the time to wait for sunrise or sunset or golden hour, or sometimes you just don't want to get up for sunset. And I know I don't always do. So let's quickly cover the different lighting scenarios that you can encounter, because you're probably going to be shooting in at least one of them. So starting with harsh light, one of my favorite times to shoot. The issue a lot of people have with harsh midday light is that there is simply too much light and it feels super difficult to make your subject stand out and to get any kind of flattering light. But I do have 3 tips that'll help you solve this. So tip number 1 is shape the light. You can use things like building entries or even bridges to block the light so it only falls into a certain portion of your composition. And if that's where your subject is, it automatically is highlighted and it stands out. And you can also use the shadows you're creating by doing this to hide things like other people or other distracting elements, which is kind of a bonus. Okay, tip number 2 is use color to make your subject pop. Because honestly, sometimes the location we're at just doesn't allow us to shape the light. And in these cases, try to use color to contrast the color of your subject with other colors around it. And this makes your subject stand out even if everything is evenly lit. Just make sure that the color of the elements around your subject doesn't distract too much from the subject itself. Okay, tip number 3 is simplify your composition. And this one's pretty straightforward. By having less in your frame, you make it easier for your viewer to understand what they're supposed to look at, and also there's less distractions in the frame. Okay, these were 3 quick tips about shooting in harsh light. I do have a whole video about it that goes a little more in depth about it, and I'll link it in the description if you like. Check it out after this video. Okay, next up we have overcast days or cloudy days. And honestly, I don't love these days, but I still do have 3 tips for you that'll help you get good photos even in very flat lighting. Because honestly, it'd be a shame to not take any photos on your travel days just because the light is flat and it's just very cloudy. So tip number 1 for overcast days is using frames. These help you establish a visual hierarchy, meaning they tell your viewer that the subject within your frame is what they should be looking at. And they also help you hide distractions. Okay, tip number 2 is overexpose the sky. Because honestly, gray skies with little to no texture in them can feel super boring and also a little bit too distracting at the same time. And by eliminating the sky, you basically simplify your composition because there's one less element with any detail on them, and you make it easier for your viewer to understand what they are looking at. And tip number 3 is simplify your composition. Much like in harsh lighting, flat light makes every little distraction visible. So by having less in your photo, you just have less distractions. And this just makes it easier for the viewer to understand what the photo is essentially about. All right, next up is shooting at night. And depending on how you're traveling, you may only have time to shoot at night on some days. And shooting at night is completely different from shooting at daytime, But of course, you guessed it, I have 3 tips for you that'll help you take great photos at night. Firstly, find a light source. This may sound like a no-brainer, but what I mean is find a light source that complements your subject. Because if your subject is not lit properly, it'll just fade into the background. And to solve this, you can use any light source that is just very common at night, like lamp posts, or even the entrances to shops that have neon signs on them that are often still lit up even after the shop closes. Okay, next up is embrace the shadows. Okay, so when shooting at night, you really want to capture the fact that you're shooting in dark conditions to really capture the mood of nights. And these shadows really create a feeling of mystery and a feeling of solitude that you can only capture at night in this way. And if you were to remove these shadows and make them really bright, you basically remove these feelings of mystery that the night gives you. So don't be afraid to let your shadows be dark and lose detail in the shadows, because the viewer doesn't need all the details. They just need the details of the most prominent things, like your light source and your subject. Okay, lastly, settings for night photography. And to be honest, there's no holy grail kind of setting for any type of photography, so I'll just share the settings that I usually use when shooting at night. My shutter speed is usually somewhere around 1/100th of a second when I'm trying to freeze the motion of moving subjects like people. Or when I want to create motion blur, I usually go as low as 1/5 of a second. Although you can go a little bit higher, like 1/20th of a second, for example. Okay, when it comes to aperture, I usually shoot at around 1.8, or if I'm using my zoom lens, I'm going as low as I can, which is f2.8. So if you don't have a lens that goes lower than f2.8, for example, don't be afraid of shooting in the dark, because you surely can. It really depends on the intensity of your light source and the ISO that your camera can handle. And to be fair, the ISO I'm using really varies depending on my aperture, which is usually as low as I can, and also my shutter speed. Basically, when I'm shooting at night, I firstly take my aperture as low as I can, as long as I'm shooting handheld. And after that, I'll take my shutter speed as low as I can. And if I want to freeze motion, I go as low as I can without having any motion blur. Like I just mentioned, I'll go to 100th, sometimes even 1/50th of a second. And from there on, I adjust my ISO to get a decently exposed image. And oftentimes my ISO is between 800 and 2500, but on some rare occasions, I even go as high as 8000 or even 10,000 ISO. And as I just mentioned, the ISO you can go to really depends on your camera. So this is more a thing of trial and error and trying to find out how much ISO your camera can handle until there's too much noise. But the thing is, with this denoise feature in Lightroom, you can really push the ISO of your camera and then denoise your camera afterwards to get rid of a lot of the noise, which is crazy actually. Or you can just keep the noise, because honestly, it does have a nostalgic look that I kind of like. Photographing crowded places can be one of the most frustrating parts of travel photography, because you feel super excited to explore this location and photograph it, and then you rock up to the place and you suddenly notice that everyone else in the city had the same idea, and your shot is just filled with tourists or even locals that are kind of in the way of your shot. And the obvious advice here would be to just wait until the crowd clears, but honestly, who has time for that, really? I know I don't. So my 2 tips for this are: one, using a slower shutter speed. So by lowering your shutter speed, you introduce motion blur, as I just mentioned. And this really helps you create a feeling of movement and energy in your shot, which is really cool. And it also removes detail from these people moving, because if you compare 2 images, one where the motion is frozen with a high shutter speed, you'll notice that these people, they're just very detailed, compared with a shot that has a lower shutter speed, where all these people kind of mesh together. And they lose all the detail, which helps the viewer find the more important details of your subject. And to achieve this effect, you one have to lower your shutter, obviously, but this means that the image will become brighter. So what you can do is to increase the aperture to the maximum, which is usually f22. On some days this is enough, but on very bright days you may need an ND filter. Okay, the second tip is using frames. So this really helps you to just block out people out of your shot, because sometimes the slow shutter is not an option, but in this case you can use elements to shoot through them. You can, for example, use arches or doorways or even other buildings and rooftops to kind of block out parts of your composition where there would be people. And this really helps you focus on your subject. And what it also does is create a kind of depth in your photo. Okay, this is basically it. So recapping, my 4 tips for better travel photography anytime and anywhere are: 1, don't only go for the obvious shot. Number 2, think in photo sets. Number 3, use any available light. And number 4, use a slow shutter or frames to deal with crowded places. Okay, I hope this video helped you, and I really tried to compress the information for this video, so I couldn't get into too much depth for the individual points. But if you have any questions, just leave me a comment or shoot me a message. I'll be happy to reply. Or if you would like a more detailed video about any of these points, just let me know and I'll be happy to make another video about any of the points that is a little more detailed. So with that being said, I hope this video helps you create with more intention, and I'll see you next Wednesday.